Tonight, we visit Asgard, but not for thunder or war god instead, for a whisper, because the softest sound in all of Asgard wasn't the flutter of Frigg's doves, but the quiet click of Loki's tongue, rolling words, like marbles in velvet, mischievous, silent, almost like a lullaby. On a night much like this, when even the stars seemed to blink more slowly, he sat by Odin's long fire, tipping stories into the flames as though they were thin streams of honey, easy and languid, and the gods, lulled by the low crackle of pine resin, let those stories drape over their shoulders like warm blankets they did not bother to question. If you happen to discover that you're still listening a few minutes from now, feel at ease to press whatever quaint button summons more of these sleepy wanderings. Though honestly, I will remain none the wiser if you forget entirely, and the universe will continue to drift along at its usual unhurried pace. The hall smelled faintly of roasted goat, and historians with too much time have argued that the goat in question was Hyren, whose udders famously produced mead instead of milk. It is a charming idea, although a trifle impractical for anyone. Whoever wanted porridge? Loki, with hair the color of late-season wheat and eyes like shallow tide pools, traced pictures in the ash with a spoon, a quiet pastime, if mildly unhygienic, and whenever a god leaned closer, he let the image shift into something flattering, a tiny mirror of their own importance. People often overlook this simple fact. Illusions work best when they are used not to hide the truth, but to complement the vanity of whoever is watching. Somewhere in the rafters, two ravens rearranged their feathers with the fastidious care of librarians shelving rather chatty books, and beyond the wall, a frost giant sneezed in its sleep, although no one thought to say bless you. In days that measured themselves by candle stubs and mead refills, time felt wider, as if it might stretch forever without tearing, and Loki filled that width with silvered laughter so thin it never woke the dreamers already nodding by the fire, nor the ember that glowed like a lone sleepy eye in the hearth. The soft web of his diversions began, as many gentle tangles do, with a small shimmering detail, a handful of golden hair belonging to Sif, Thor's much-admired wife, slipped away in the moonlight as effortlessly as soap from wet fingers. The strands, each finer than spider silk, yet tougher than a farmer's patience in winter, caught the starlight on Loki's sleeve, and he considered them with the absent curiosity one might give to breadcrumbs after a lightly disappointing biscuit. He whispered that he would, of course, replace them. He was nothing if not courteous in the abstract, and then ambled down to the dwarven forges, where hammers kept the underground time, pinging and chiming like insomniac songbirds who had discovered metallurgy. The dwarves inspected the request, stroked their beards in slow unison, and obliged, partly because they cherished challenges, and partly because Loki promised a gratitude, so warm and intangible it could fit in even the smallest pocket. For an age that treasured grand gestures of valor, it is slightly amusing that some of its finest relics, the golden hair, Odin's spear, a certain ship that folds up conveniently, like a picnic blanket, were all the result of what might be called a mild social misunderstanding. Deep in those stone halls, runes glowed with just enough light to read, but never enough to disturb shadows that preferred privacy, and each rune knew that if recited backward, it would politely refuse to exist, a safe clause for anyone nervous about permanent magic. Meanwhile, trust among the gods thinned like gruel stretched to feed too many guests. No quarrels erupted because quarrels require energy, and the atmosphere remained as calm as a field after harvest. Yet the air carried the faint metallic scent of almost forgiven mischief. Loki strolled back with new hair as bright as midsummer. Straw, humming a tune the dwarves considered the height of sophistication 9 notes long, none of them in a hurry, and draped it over Sif's head while she dozed, so softly that when she woke, she suspected only that the lighting in the hall had improved. If curiosity occasionally nudges you awake, you might like to know that the dwarves graded their gold by how nicely it reflected the prospect of a nap. This particular batch was rated excellent for drowsy afternoons, a certification rarely granted. The days fluttered onward like pages in a wind too gentle to bother closing the window, and under that breeze a growl began, distant and low, the kind of sound you might first mistake for your own stomach regretting a late-night snack. It belonged, of course, to Fenrir, the wolf pup whose paws already looked like oversized mittens knitted by an enthusiastic relative. To keep him company, the universe supplied siblings, Jarmangander, a serpent destined to grow so long it could rest its chin on its tail in a circle of polite self-containment, and Hal, whose calm demeanor resembled a librarian's sigh. Loki, proud in a vague parental sense, observed them with the tranquil bemusement of someone watching bread dough rise. Inevitable, slow, and slightly magical if you do not overthink the yeast. The gods decided, in their measured way, to bind Fenrir gently as one tucks extra blankets around a restless sleeper. They tried cords of silk, which unraveled, then chains of iron, which he wore like jangly jewelry for a season, until at last they requested a ribbon from the same dwarves, who by now considered unbreakable merely an interesting design brief. Gleipnir, the resulting band, was woven from 6 impossibilities, including the sound of a cat's footfall and the breath of a fish items chosen, perhaps because no survey had yet been conducted to confirm their absence from inventory. When Tyr, whose patience equaled the tide in its persistence, offered his hand as collateral, he did so with the resigned politeness of someone holding a friend's squirming ferret during a particular long queue. Fenrir bit, the hand was lost, and tavern gossip insisted it made an excellent stirring stick for broth. Tyr preferred not to comment. The wolf, ribbon-bound, settled eventually into an uneasy nap, dreaming, according to later poets, of meadows filled with endless squeaky toys. In the hush that followed, no one raised voices or shook fists. Asgard merely carried on, placing the incident neatly on a shelf labeled to be addressed eventually, right next to a jar containing the collective dread of administrative paperwork. Ravagers of worlds might note this as a pivotal moment, but from a sleepy bedtime vantage, it is simply another tale ambling past, trailing soft echoes like footprints in thick moss. Time, that courteous houseguest, brewed tea for itself and sat quietly while the sky over Bifrost blushed unmuted. Red, the color of embers hiding beneath cool ash. The gods stood along the rainbow bridge in gentle silence, appearing less like warriors, awaiting destiny and more like travelers checking a timetable that perpetually reads, delayed. Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, traced wide, looping. Arcs, writing thoughts and memories across the clouds in invisible ink that only history would bother decoding. Loki, boots dangling over the edge of a marble balustrade, noted that twilight smelled faintly of distant thunder mixed with the earthy scent you detect just before rain chooses its first drop location. People sometimes forget that Ragnarok, for all its reputation, was preceded by a remarkably long moment of everyone knowing yet politely not mentioning it, rather like noticing the guest of honor has spinach on their tooth and deciding the situation will likely resolve itself. In this lull, Loki envisioned mazes within mazes, corridors of outcomes spiraling so gently they felt like lullabies sung in geometry. If the listener wonders why prophecies insist on dramatic endings, it might be worth proposing that they simply never acquired the art of graceful exiting. Some stories bow, others keep chatting at the doorway for an hour. A soft rustle drifted through the air, perhaps the gods adjusting ceremonial cloaks that always seemed half a size too warm. And even Thor, who normally rumbled like summer storms, clearing their throats, only sighed. the sound blending with the breeze until neither could remember which of them began it. Some were a solitary goat, possibly Tandrasnir or Tangenjostre, though they are notoriously difficult to tell apart. Without paperwork, nibbled at a patch of sky blue moss and found it pleasantly bland, the culinary equivalent of bedtime reading. The world, poised on the quiet lip of what scholars label inevitability, faded into the kind of silence that glows rather than echoes, and the tale itself loosened its laces, ready to wander onward in soft slippers, neither finishing nor insisting. On continuation, simply drifting in a half-whispered hum that wraps around the night like a gentle, unknotted ribbon, leaving thought to float unanchored, slow, and entirely content to drowse. You may be quietly curious to learn that the slowest thing in all 9 worlds is not a glacier creaking over centuries or a dreaming Yatun rolling in its sleep, but rather the single unhurried bubble that rises each evening from the fathom deep, Kettle in Jir's underwater hall, lifting with the kind of languid resolve a feather might show when deciding whether to drift left or right. It begins almost shyly at the cauldron's steel dark floor, swelling by fractions no algebra has bothered to note, and for the better part of an hour it eases past ripples of golden mead, polishing itself on currents so gentle they could be mistaken for well-mannered sighs. By the time it reaches the surface, the bubble carries a fragrance said to remind the attentive nose of roasted barley, wet sand warmed by moonlight, and the faint memory of a song a ship once hummed while waiting for the tide. Should you discover that you are still awake when that bubble finally kisses open air, you might feel inclined to summon further installments of these drowsy chronicles by clicking whatever subtle contraption enables such things, though I assure you no offense will be taken if your eyelids veto the idea first. Jir, the sea giant host, stands nearby polishing a ladle that legend claims could scoop an entire fjord at once, though in practice it mostly stirs the surface now and then just to keep the phone thinking about its future. He does this with the slow, repetitive motion of someone buttering 1,000 slices of toast for a breakfast that may or may not happen, and each gentle swirl traces pale spirals that drift outward until they forget they were ever spirals at all. Every so often, he pauses to listen to the hush of the hall, the subtle slosh of distant tides, the echo of a crab adjusting its suspenders, the creak of a barnacle practicing diplomacy with a mussel, and decides that yes, silence remains at an acceptable volume, not 5 arm lengths away. The youngest of Jir's 9 daughters fusses over goblets the way some people fuss over houseplants, murmuring little compliments, rotating them for even glow, and occasionally tapping to be sure the resonance feels friendly. Her name is Himinglava, which roughly translates to the glimmer you notice only if you're not looking, and she takes pride in wiping away the outline of each previous sip so carefully that even the god of forensics would find no fingerprints. If the god of forensics were ever invited. While she works, her sisters glide through the hall like thoughts one almost remembers upon waking, shoulders brushing curtains of soft green water lit by bioluminescent plankton who never seem to tire of pretending they are lanterns. Kolga counts the tiny whirlpools beneath the long banquet tables, each vortex hardly bigger than a button, yet entirely convinced it is a storm. Diffa arranges napkins folded into improbable origami shapes, squid reading newspapers, oysters deep, and philosophical debate, even a modest kraken taking a polite bow. Visitors have remarked that Jir's daughters converse in tides rather than sentences, ebbing into pauses, flowing into murmured jokes whose punchlines are mostly the satisfaction of not needing laughter. At precisely the moment a bubble meets the ceiling, the sisters offer a toast to its bravery quietly, of course, for bravery that small needs gentle handling, and then return to polishing, folding, and counting, as though the universe were knit together by the steady click of their understated industry. Some scholars insist these tasks keep the seas from unraveling. Others claim the tasks simply keep boredom from staging a coup. Either conclusion seems equally polite beyond the long stone balustrade that marks the edge of the feasting chamber. The walls open into an aquarium, wide panorama of drifting kelp gardens where ancient fish glide like slow-moving ornaments in a snow globe no one has thought to shake. Here, in the gentlest current, a silver seal dozes belly up, occasionally applauding its own dreams with flipper twitches, while a shoal of lanternfish performs what amounts to a dress rehearsal for dawn, but without the pressure of an audience. Jir steps to the balcony, ladle still in hand, and lowers his voice to a tone softer than whale lullabies as he discusses fermentation with the tide itself, which listens politely, despite having heard the explanation every night since the first. Algae decided to ferment anything at all. The tide, for its part, replies in a language composed largely of delayed echoes and subtle rearrangements of salt, assuring Jir that, yes, the mead is coming along nicely, and no, the foam will not stage a rebellion this evening. It is worth mentioning that Jir's kettle never overboils because the water surrounding it is patient. The sea enjoys a good simmer, but finds boiling rather dramatic and best reserved for gossip. Somewhere near the ceiling, thick strands of seaweed sway like slow pendulums, counting seconds that prefer not to be counted, and barnacle choirs hold their rehearsals in extreme pianissimo, singing notes so low they feel more like wool blankets. Then sound. Visitors from Asgard often arrive, expecting spectacle, perhaps Poseidon popping by for a competitive wave duel. But they quickly learn that the only duel in this hall is between drowsiness and the faint curiosity about how many. Bubbles might rise tonight. The smart money is on drowsiness, which has never lost a match below sea level. Closer to the hearth, more a politely glowing heap of phosphorescent shells than actual fire, sits a single stool reserved for Ran, Jir's wife, who enjoys embroidering. Nets so delicate they could catch only compliments, though catching compliments is precisely her ambition. She threads kelp fiber dyed the pale blush of dawn clouds and hums a lullaby, whose melody drifts through the hall like the scent of warm bread lingering hours after the loaf is gone. From time to time she pauses, not because she has reached the end of a pattern, but because pausing is part of the pattern, the breathing space where the next wave of thread decides how softly it should land. Jir watches her with the kind of fondness normally reserved for overachieving houseplants, then returns to his ladle, giving the kettle a half turn so slow it could be mistaken for a thoughtful shrug. The foam sighs appreciatively, releasing a new bouquet of aromas: cedar-smoked apples, old library dust mixed with clover honey, and something faintly reminiscent of summer rain drifting through an open bakery window at closing time. If by chance you're still listening as these scents wander past, you might notice your own breathing has adopted the cauldron's pace. One inhalation per drifting idea, one exhalation per gently solved riddle. No one in the hall remarks on the phenomenon. Even commentary has learned to whisper as the evening stretches itself like a cat across worn tiles. Guests filter in with the drowsy dignity of clouds, changing shapes just because it seems polite. A pair of wind spirits arrive wearing shawls woven from yesterday's breezes. They compare the softness of their fabric by holding it to their cheeks and nodding appreciatively before allowing the shawls to slip off and wander away on their own recognizance. A minor smith from Svartalfheim excuses himself for arriving late. He misplaced his favorite hammer inside a different hammer and spent an hour coaxing it free, then promptly falls asleep against a pillar, still standing, which the pillar finds flattering. Even Thor has been known to stop by, though tonight he sends regrets. Apparently, he is busy counting how many sparks a single swing of Mjolnir can tease from a whetstone. a pastime only mildly more exciting than watching barnacles debate philosophy. In Thor's absence, his seat is occupied by an elderly seal who offers a speech about the superiority of mid-temperature waters for joint health, but the speech is delivered entirely in polite blinks and therefore easy to tune out. Jeers. Daughters glide between these visitors, refilling goblets before thirst even considers stretching its legs, and if a guest should attempt gratitude, the waves accept it with smiles that feel like soft pillows hidden inside smiles. Somewhere beneath the tables, a shy octopus rearranges lost sandals into avant-garde sculpture. Though critics are few and easily distracted by the slow joy of existing, occasionally a harpoon scar on the wall emits a faint echo of something. Tense that once happened here, but Rand simply drapes a fresh net over it, and the scar settles back into silence, content to be a story for another night. Past the middle hour, when surface dwellers mark the difference between late night and very early morning, Jir rings a bell carved from a single pearl so large it once held a family of hermit crabs, who all insisted it was rent-controlled. The bell's tone is so low it might be felt more than heard, like remembering the last line of a dream just before it fades. This is the hall's invitation to what scholars have translated as the contemplative sip, a moment in which each guest lifts a goblet, inspects the swirl of mead as though it contains a private galaxy, and takes exactly one swallow. No more, no less, thereby ensuring the universe remains politely balanced. The mead itself tastes faintly of toasted oats embroidered with whispers of elderflower, but also, curiously, of the quiet relief that comes from crossing a task off a list you had forgotten mattered. After the sip, conversation lapses into hush. The hush drifts into sigh. The sigh reshapes itself into the soft hush of waves. And in that hush, the bubble arising from the kettle's center begins its next patient ascent. Content to take as long as eternity, plus the time it takes to find. A comfortable pillow. Thales insists that if anyone manages to remain awake for 7 consecutive bubbles, Jir will teach them the recipe for eternal poem. But surviving even 3 bubbles without dozing has proven challenging, given that each bubble prefers a schedule, best measured in the length of gentle yawns dot so the night settles deeper, like a quilt added to another quilt in a room already warm, and the water beyond the balcony darkens to a shade somewhere between ink and sleep itself. Lanternfish dim their glow to half-brightness, considerate of anyone who might be light-sensitive in their dreams, and the barnacle choir begins a lullaby consisting entirely of pauses, the rest in music strung together until they form a melody of nothing. Jir, satisfied that the foam has been adequately admired, leans his ladle against the cauldron and watches as a final stream of tiny bubbles forms a constellation that resembles, if you tilt your head and squint gently, a map of wandering thoughts headed nowhere in particular. Ran lays her embroidery aside, nets trailing from her fingers like delicate thoughts not quite spoken, and wonders aloud whether tomorrow she might stitch a pattern that looks exactly like the feeling of a long exhale. No one disagrees. Disagreement would involve verbs that seem excessive at this hour. A drift of sea, snow, those soft flakes of organic hush that wander down through deep water, is visible now beyond the arches, and the hall itself feels suspended in that snowfall, buoyed by the slow buoyancy of contentment. The kettle hums a note so low it might simply be the heartbeat of stillness, and Jir's daughters close their eyes for a breath long enough to cross an ocean, then open them to find everything pleasantly unchanged. Somewhere far above, moonlight frets about whether it will ever reach this depth, not realizing its concern has already arrived in the shimmer along every goblet rim, and so the tale glides onward without goal or goodbye, like the softest tide slipping through the narrowest inlet, carrying with it the hush of foam, the murmur of bubbles, the faintest perfume of mead, and the gentle promise that nothing, absolutely nothing, requires your attention anymore, except perhaps the quiet pleasure of drifting exactly where the next patient bubble leads. You may find it quietly surprising that the softest sigh in all the Asgard is neither the hush of moonlit snow nor the distant murmur of a dreaming yacht tune, but the barely audible sound an apple makes the instant it realizes it is perfectly, luminously ripe. That sigh drifts through Eden's orchard just before dawn, a breath so fine it could slip through a woven scarf without disturbing a single thread. And on certain mornings, if the breeze is feeling helpful, it carries the sweet hint of honey and pine all the way to the high stone rampart where Heimdall pretends not to notice he has started salivating. In this orchard, dew arrives punctually like a polite guest who brings its own slippers. Each drop selects a leaf, settles down, and rehearses how it will glint when the first ribbon of sunlight ambles across the sky, because nothing here is ever in a hurry. Idun herself moves among the trees with the deliberate grace of someone turning the pages of a very old, very favorite book thumb, lightly brushing each edge, just to be sure every story remembers it is loved. If you happen to remain awake by the time her third apple receives a whispered compliment, you might feel welcome to summon another episode of these sleepy wanderings by pressing whatever small rune-shaped button lies nearby. Though I will confess the apples are terribly uninterested in subscriber counts, and equally forgiving if you drift off mid-thought. She wears an apron stitched from the faded petals of last century's wild roses, the fabric smelling faintly of sun-warmed parchment, and keeps a tiny brush tucked behind her ear for polishing stems until they feel confident about their posture. One might expect the orchard to sing with birds at this hour. Instead, it hums gently with bees still half asleep, each one practicing the first syllable of a rather complicated buzz before committing to the rest of the sentence. These bees, incidentally, are all politely named Bob partly because they dislike introductions that take longer than a wing beat, partly because Idun can never remember whether the one with the extra fluffy knees is actually Rob or Dob, and partly because the trees have grown fond of a chorus that sounds like 100 tiny lawnmowers warming up for the world's most leisurely race. Bob the Third hovers by a blossom, considers the pollen like a sommelier squinting at a backlit glass, and then nods with that slow satisfaction generally reserved for librarians discovering a misplaced bookmark. Above him leaves the color of fresh pistachio sway and pears, murmuring about last night's constellation gossip, apparently. The stars spent several hours debating whether Orion's belt is elasticated, and each leaf is happy to summarize the minutes of that meeting for anyone who shows the faintest interest, which is luckily no one at all. By late morning, the orchard settles into its second heartbeat, the one reserved for gentle chores. Labels must be rewritten in ink made from diluted twilight, and circumference strings, soft links of braided spider silk, are draped around selected apples to ensure they are growing wide but not boastful. Idun favors a pen shaped like a very small serpent who naps between words. She dips its tail in ink and writes each rune at a pace so slow that the letter has time to wonder whether it truly wishes to exist before committing to the page. Every 10 minutes she pauses to stretch, because even immortal wrists prefer kindness, and during these pauses she tells the nearest tree a mildly absurd fact today. It is that Odin once attempted to pickle thunder in a jar for travel snacks, only to discover that thunder dislikes confinement and will, given opportunity, unscrew its own lid. The tree, which is accustomed to such gossip, rustles politely, showering her hair with a confetti of gold-flecked leaf dust that smells faintly of cinnamon bark left too close to a fireplace. Small, shimmering runes begin to appear uncertain. Apple skins as the sun climbs, tiny shapes that resemble sleepy constellations looking for somewhere to nap. Scholars would be thrilled to catalog these glow spots, but scholars rarely venture here. Idun encouraged them by leaving a single apple on the path, labeled, "For research, if you dare," and each scholar who reaches for it feels an overwhelming need to lie down and have a little think first, at which point the orchard politely relocates itself 30 paces east and forgets the scholar ever existed. It is rumored that some of the runes spell embarrassing metaphors. Last week, one apple compared itself to a well-adjusted badger, but the runes fade before anyone can confirm, leaving only the faint impression of a smile. Mid-afternoon finds the orchard at its most theatrical, which is to say hardly theatrical at all. A family of squirrels arrives via an overhead branch, each one delivering the latest news in pantomime gestures because they have sworn off speaking during daylight to preserve vocal freshness. Their tails swish out headlines apparently. Nidhogg has started composting bones into excellent fertilizer, and Idun responds with nods measured in half-beats of a lullaby. She rewards the messengers with slivers of apple core dipped in. Lazy honey, which the squirrels accept with the solemnity of diplomats receiving medals for strategic lounging. The entire exchange is so unhurried that a passing snail, delayed by existential musings on the nature of shell acoustics, overtakes the conversation and feels quietly proud for the rest of the week that at the far edge of the orchard stands a narrow table carved from driftwood bleached by centuries of polite crashing waves. On this table perches a ledger so thick it has developed its own gentle gravity well. Here Idun records every apple's mood from softly confident to pleasantly oblivious. She grades texture on a scale that begins at sunlit velvet and ends at cloud pretending to be fruit, though very few apples achieve the latter because clouds are notoriously hard to imitate without an uplifting breeze. Whenever she scribes, she whispers the words aloud not because the orchard cannot read, but because the orchard enjoys the auditory tickle of vowels rolling across consonants like pebbles sliding down a lazy shore. Occasionally she misplaces the ledger beneath a pile of moss-lined baskets, and the baskets remain perfectly still, feigning ignorance, because they have a shy fondness for important paperwork. As the sun begins its languid descent, the bees finish their final patrols. Each bob returns to a miniature hive resembling a teapot someone forgot to stop painting. They line up at the entrance, do a brief waggle that would be considered scandalously energetic if the orchard cared, and tumble inside where they will. Spend the evening sipping traces of nectar and arguing over whether dandelions count as formal wear. Idun waves goodnight with a handkerchief embroidered with the runic shorthand for "May your pollen dreams be lightly spiced," then turns to the sapling enclosure, checking that every young tree has exactly 3 bedtime stories cued in its bark, one about rain, one about soil, and one about the philosophical merits of gentle breezes. No sapling has ever requested the ending of these stories, as endings feel too conclusive for being still deciding how tall to grow. In the cool hush of nearing twilight, a silver kettle suspended above a charcoal snuff box releases a single fragrant puff of steam. Inside, dew collected at dawn has mingled with thin slices of apple peel and a twist of clover stem to create a tea, so mild it could be mistaken for a pleasant memory of tea rather than the beverage itself. Idun pours a thimbleful onto the roots of the oldest tree, a courteous gesture roughly equivalent to offering a friend the last piece of shortbread. The tree responds with a creak so contented it resembles the sound of an armchair sighing beneath a well-loved blanket, and somewhere nearby a cricket adjusts its chirp to harmonize with the creak, achieving a duet that would earn polite applause. If anyone were still clapping at this hour, dusk settles over the orchard like a quilt stitched from dusk itself, all mauves and warm grays sprinkled with the first timid stars. Idun begins her final round, lifting each apple destined for tomorrow's basket and placing it into wooden crates lined with moss fluffed to the consistency of happy thoughts. She talks to the apples as she works, not words so much as vowel-heavy hums that feel like soft cushions sliding across polished wood. And each apple responds by deepening its color a shade, as though blushing with satisfied shyness. The crates exhale a faint scent of pine sap meeting vanilla, and the evening air carries it toward the distant halls of Asgard, where even the bravest warriors occasionally stop mid-boast to wonder why the night suddenly smells like bedtime. Stars, multiply slowly, preferring not to crowd the silence, and the orchard lamp, an orb of firefly gentleness suspended from a willow branch dims, itself by degrees until it glows like a memory of light. Idun wipes her hands on her apron, checks that every tree has an even number of leaves facing moonward, and utters a soft promise that she will return at dawn with fresh stories and perhaps a new brush if the old one feels overworked. Somewhere, beyond the fence, a soft wind rehearses the lullaby it will sing later to the mountains, and the trees listen with polite interest before deciding they much prefer the local version sung by Idun's own exhalations. And so the night settles in, gentle and obliging, wrapping orchard and keeper alike in a hush, so complete it might be mistaken for the pause between heartbeats if one were intent on counting such things. Apples dream of ripening yet further into an impossible sweetness. Bees dream of warm updrafts that carry them exactly nowhere in the nicest possible way. And Idun dreams of new labels that smell faintly of cedar and contain runes shaped like yawns. The tale, meanwhile, continues without hurry, like a river so slow it forgets it is moving, and should you drift away now, the orchard will keep whispering its leaf-soft gossip to whoever remains, content in the knowledge that even silence enjoys a good bedtime story. You might find it quietly intriguing that the guardian of the Rainbow Bridge, who can hear grass growing and a feather land upon snow, still relies on a humble flock of woolly assistants to keep the long midnight hours from slipping entirely into sameness. Each evening, as the last sunset color folds itself into the first violet note of night, Heimdall steps to the very edge of Bifrost and begins his ritual of counting sheep, though not to invite sleep, which never visits a sentinel as watchful as he, but to measure the hush that settles across the 9 worlds, when most hearts turn inward to dreaming. The first sheep to drift through the shimmering gate is always Cloud Whisper, named for the faint swirl of silver wool that crowns her. Head like frost in miniature, she trots with the deliberation of a librarian shelving a favorite book, pausing just long enough for her hoofprints to catch the rainbow light and send tiny prisms darting toward the river below. Heimdall marks her presence with a barely perceptible nod, something smaller than a blink, and in that nod lies all the patient ceremony that eternity requires. People often imagine guardianship as stern or restless, yet in truth it resembles the slow exhale of an ocean too content to gather storms. Soon after comes Pebble Nap, whose wool carries speckles matching the stones that line the brook beneath. The bridge. It is said that Pebble Nap can identify any riverbed in Midgard by texture alone, though to date no one has found the polite reason to test this talent. Heimdall greets the speckled A-way with a soft hum pitched low enough to glide under. The winds gossip. The hem is neither song nor speech, more like the memory of distant bells deciding whether they once existed. Far below, a wandering breeze pockets the sound for later, like a traveler tucking away an unfamiliar coin simply because it feels pleasant between the fingers. The flock expands, one gentle silhouette at a time, until the bridge glows with soft bleats and muffled hoofbeats, each step stirring motes of color that drift lazily before settling again where they began. Heimdall counts in a language that uses pauses instead of numbers, a rhythm passed down from shepherd stars who prefer silence. To mathematics. Every 17th sheep, or perhaps it is every 17th pause, he tilts Jolahern a fraction, as though reminding the horn where it is, the way one might pat a sleeping dog just to assure it that all is well. The horn answers with a faint, ivory warmth, no louder than the sigh of parchment turned by cautious fingers. Somewhere near the midpoint of the watch, moonlight arrives to rehearse its quiet duet with the bridge. Each ray touches a ripple of color, then moves on, unsure whether it interrupted a private conversation between red and indigo. Heimdall's smile, small as a comma, acknowledges the moon without requesting commentary. Scholars occasionally debate how many smiles a single guardian accumulates over millennia, but the ledger is kept in silence and the ink, if it exists, is invisible even to ravens who pride themselves on discovering secrets others have mislaid. Meanwhile, the sheep continue their leisurely parade, swapping places with the sort of courtesy reserved for elevator door choreography performed by shy professionals. A tiny break in the rhythm arrives when Buttercup, a lamb so recently added to the roster that her bleat still squeaks like a hinge in need of a tiny drop of oil, pauses to inspect her own reflection in the bridge's glossy arc. The reflection, obliged by optics to amplify the rainbow, shows Buttercup wearing 7 thin scarves of color, and she seems briefly concerned about coordinating them. Heimdall leans down, offers a single encouraging wink, measured precisely to reassure without startling, and Buttercup toddles on, apparently convinced that fashion at midnight is best defined by whatever happens to be glowing underfoot dot further along. A sleeping Yatun cloud drifts overhead, its snores subtle enough to be mistaken for distant surf. Each snore sends a thither light tremor through Bifrost, making the colors shimmer in gentle applause. Heimdall listens closely, half out of duty and half because comparing snore patterns is a private hobby he rarely mentions. Some are coastal, some inland, a few distinctly fjord adjacent. Tonight's variety sounds like low tide curling under old piers, and he files the observation away with the quiet satisfaction of someone labeling seashells by the memories they inspire rather than by strict taxonomy dot by now the flock has reached. 24, though time's elastic drift renders the count simultaneously precise and leisurely. At the 24th pause, Heimdall adjusts his footing, allowing the bridge to hum beneath him. The hum is neither a warning nor a welcome, merely the structural version of clearing one's throat to stay attentive. A single star, undecided about its brightness, blinks a short apology and dims, perhaps to avoid attracting unnecessary notice. In a modest joke shared only with himself, Heimdall silently thanks the star for its discretion, as if the heavens could ever reveal too much in one sitting. Toward the far end of the arc, a warm patch of air rises from Midgard, bringing with it the scent of freshly baked rye and the faint echo of a lullaby sung by someone balancing exhaustion with tenderness. The scent arrives like a polite knock on a half-open door, and the guardian inhales slowly, cataloging its layers: grain, hearth smoke, and the tiniest flourish of cardamom. The sheep graze on nothing in particular bridge. Light has no flavor yet seems to satisfy them, and their chewing adds a soft syncopation that makes the night feel as though it is rocking gently in a cradle too vast for walls. When the count reaches 33, though debates persist about whether sheep or commas are being tallied, Heimdall allows a small digression. He wonders, not for the first time, whether Jallarhorn dreams during these quiet intervals. If it does, perhaps it dreams of being a seashell held to a colossal ear, amplifying stories rather than alarms. The notion pleases him, and he lets it rest beside the thought of Buttercup's 7 scarves, forming a tiny constellation of cozy ideas hovering just behind his sternum. A little while later, a pair of starlings swoops in, drawn by the same mysterious instinct that compels people to open empty refrigerators just to see the light come on. They loop twice around the bridge, apparently debating whether rainbow refractions improve feather sheen, then settle upon the horn's rim for a moment of contemplative preening. Heimdall counts them as honorary sheep numbers 34 and 35, a decision he keeps to himself because explaining humor to starlings can be tricky. They tend to interrupt with impromptu choreography. The third transition of the night comes disguised as a hush, so complete it feels like the universe, holding its breath before a particularly delicate bookmark is inserted. Each sheep slows, almost imperceptibly, as though aligning heartbeat with silence, and the bridge responds by dimming its outermost bands to a subdued pastel rarely seen by day. Heimdall taps a fingertip against the railing, producing a note, faint and round, which drifts downward until it finds the river's surface and rides along like a skipping stone in slow motion. Somewhere below, a salmon turns over in its sleep, convinced it has just heard an interesting rumor about Plankton Dot at Count 42. Old Mossbeard ambles up, his fleece a sprawling map of lichen greens and grayish blues. Folktales insist Mossbeard was once mistaken for a hill and given a commemorative plaque, a rumor Mossbeard neither confirms nor denies. Tonight he carries a sprig of juniper just behind his left ear, a detail unnoticed by everyone except the guardian, who files it under pleasant eccentricities that make eternity breathable. The juniper releases a hint of resin whenever Mossbeard nods, and the scent mingles with distant rye to produce an aroma not yet catalogued by any kitchen, but fervently awaited by insomniac bakers everywhere. Gradually the stars rearrange themselves into patterns only astronomers lost in reverie could recognize, and the sheep begin their gentle return loop, assuring each hoofprint that nothing essential has shifted. Heimdall counts them back with the same economy of sound, and each pause feels like the soft closing of a well-loved book whose ending is happily familiar. Buttercup totters past once more, evidently satisfied with her scarf situation. Pebble Nap shakes out a last pebble-colored yawn. Cloud Whisper heads the procession again, proving that loops can be comforting when they pretend to be lines. Just before the silver edge of dawn begins erasing the darker blues, Heimdall rests a poem upon Jallarhorn and lets a final breath travel the length of the instrument, not enough to summon, merely enough to remind. The breath resonates like a seashell's memory of tide, inaudible to sleeping mortals, yet clear to anyone who has ever counted more than dreams in a single night. One by one, the sheep step off the bridge toward a meadow only they seem to notice, where dewdrops wait on blades of grass like tiny round invitations to breakfast. As the guardian watches them fade into early mist, he marks the completion of the count, not with a flourish or an end, but with an unhurried comma that invites the next sentence of night to begin whenever darkness chooses to return. The bridge brightens, exchanging moonlit pastels for sunlit exuberance, but Heimdall keeps his gaze soft, letting morning unfurl at its own pace. Somewhere a starling realizes it fell asleep on the horn and flutters away, slightly embarrassed, while the horn does its best impression of a statue too dignified to laugh. And so the watch rolls gently onward. Sheep will gather again. Commas will stack like quiet stepping stones, and anyone drifting nearby may discover that counting, when done at the measured fringe of the rainbow, is less about numbers and more about letting even time itself find a comfortable patch of grass upon which to close its eyes. You might find it quietly intriguing that the crispest linen in all the 9 worlds is stitched not by nimble dwarven fingers, nor by the industrious Norns, but by the wind itself as it folds and refolds the great bedsheets of cloud that drift above Asgard each mild, unrushed afternoon. Frigg, keeper of keys, mother of gentle strategies, and undisputed curator of household serenity, has long maintained that even the sky deserves a proper airing out, and so every 7th day on an hour that chooses itself rather than being chosen, she summons a slow breeze, the kind that behaves like a helpful cousin offering to carry only the lightest groceries, and prepares for what the ravens teasingly call her laundry spectacle. Of course, nothing remotely spectacular occurs. That is precisely the point. Beneath a vault of pale blue that looks as though someone pressed all tension out of it with the flat of a calming palm, Frigg unbuttons the horizon, coaxing cloud cover. Down as gently as one might slide a sleeping baby from shoulder to cradle. The clouds arrive in cooperative layers, some smelling faintly of yesterday's drizzle, others edged with a hint of upcoming snow nobody feels rushed about predicting. If you discover you are still awake while she shakes out a cumulus the size of a quiet meadow, you might decide, entirely at your own leisurely pace, to click whatever modern rune invites more episodes of this whisper-level housekeeping. But rest assured that even if you drift off mid-click, the sky will remain on good behavior, and no cloud will wrinkle out of spite. The first scene, the gathering, takes place upon a lawn so impossibly level that visiting architects suspect it is an optical illusion designed by grass with a flair for geometry. Frigg strolls through it in slippers made of wool spun so finely that the sheep who donated it now walk with a subtle strut, as though aware their fleece has achieved destiny. She carries a basket fashioned from willow branches soaked for 13 hours in a tea of chamomile and patience, a recipe guaranteed to ward off creaks. Into this basket she lowers each cloud after a brief inspection, holding it up to the sun, which obligingly tilts an angle to highlight any stubborn shadow caught in the weave. Occasionally she flicks a shadow free with a thumb, and it scoots away like a shy beetle seeking a darker corner. The sun, pleased, smooths light over the gap until even Odin's discerning eye could not detect the former blemish. A soft joke rolls through the air. Frigg remarks that some shadows behave like grown children visiting home, refusing to leave unless escorted, and the breeze laughs in a sound not unlike parchment turning itself. Scholars recording these events in notebooks that will never be published note that laughter from air molecules has no echo, which seems fitting given the modesty of the humor involved. Once the basket brims, Frigg steps toward the great washing pool that glimmers behind Valhalla, like a secret kept mostly for fun. The pool is fed by springs so calm they apologize for each ripple, and the water holds the clearer half of every reflective thought. Here the second scene unfolds, the washing, or more precisely, the thoughtful soaking. Frigg lowers each cloud until the waterline kisses away traces of travel dust from mountain peaks, pollen from wandering bees that took a wrong exit, a careless spark from Thor's last thunder rehearsal. There's no scrubbing, only immersion and release. Clouds are delicate creatures, and besides, they respond thus to kindness. After a suitable pause, measured not in minutes, but in loosened tension, she lifts them out in a line of attendant. Wains awaits with small silver combs to fluff each vapor tuft into a buoyant lather. One particularly earnest gust a newcomer named. Breezelet for its size and enthusiasm tries too hard and accidentally styles a stratus into what resembles an ambitious pompadour. Frigg smiles, reshapes the tuft with 2 slow pinches, and assures Breezelet that originality is always welcome so long as it remembers the overall mood is almost asleep. Overhead, the sky wears its bareness comfortably, like a roof that knows it hasn't leaked in centuries. The sun leans on a lukewarm ray, content to watch ideas of clouds drift through memories of clouds. The third scene brings us to the line drying, which takes place upon a marvelous cord, spun from moonbeams braided with a sigh of first frost. The cord stretches between 2 pillars carved from petrified dawn, each pillar humming a note so low it encouraged moths to nap. Frigg drapes each cloud with the care of setting down a teacup during polite conversation, smoothing edges that resist, and patting corners that attempt to puff in modest bravado. Meanwhile, a flock of swans paddles lazy figure eights across the nearby reflecting pond, offering commentary through occasional wing flicks that mean, in swan etiquette, looking fluffy today. Somewhere along the cord, a small nimbus stratus complains of feeling listless. Frigg suggests it contemplate becoming rain next month, if schedules permit, and the cloud murmurs agreement, relieved to have purpose, yet pleased it is a distant one. Should your thoughts wander at this point, as thoughts are wont to do, perhaps you will notice how similar the hanging clouds appear to freshly laundered duvets airing on a suburban balcony, except these duvets span acres and cradle starlight. Residue in their quilting? If that comparison nudges you toward the comforting smell of detergent memories, so be it. Frigg certainly would not begrudge you a yawn inspired by domestic parallels. The fourth and longest scene is the folding, and art in which Frigg holds quiet mastery. By now the clouds are lighter than promise and twice as patient. She brings them one at a time to a marble table polished by centuries of polite applause from passing breezes. With 2 deliberate movements, she tucks each end toward the middle, then presses a palm flat to settle fluff, producing a whisper of dewy mist that rises and dissipates like the final note of a lullaby. As she stacks the folded cloud cirrus on cumulus on stratus, they form a gentle tiered cake of weather, sweet without sugar and tall without vanity. Odin passes by at a distance, pretending he needs nothing, but pauses to run a finger along the stack, collecting a bead of mist that he pockets for later predictions. He says nothing, because to remark would fracture the hush, and hush is half the ritual's success. At the finish, Frigg slides the marble table back beneath a portico grown specifically to shade contentment, and the stacked clouds wait for their gradual release into tomorrow's sky, where they will drift and drowse and perhaps recall being folded. The breeze, sensing conclusion, yet knowing there should never be one, circulates a last faint irony mentioning to nobody in particular that raincoats, despite their speciality, are rarely invited to these proceedings, and the remark curls into soft laughter among the garden hedges before dissolving entirely. Above, the naked firmament begins inviting the first velvet specks of evening star, and the air carries the mild aroma of nothing happening urgently at all. Somewhere in this pause, if you have not already slipped into the slow slide of dream, you might catch your own breathing syncing with the pace of folding and unfolding, a rhythm ancient as comfort itself. And there, in the space between one folded cloud and the unhurried release of the next, the story declines to finish, preferring instead to drift like unworn linen toward a silence so gentle it folds itself around you, promising to hold its shape until morning decides to knock. You might be gently surprised to learn that the most patient clock in all of Vanaheim is not a sundial or a moss speckled hourglass, but a modest length of silver-gray driftwood propped against Njord's porch. Its only hands the creeping salt line that rises and falls along its grain each evening. Tonight, under a twilight sky the color of watered-down lavender tea, the sea god lifts that plank with the deliberate care of someone removing a bookmark from a beloved but perpetually unfinished novel, and he walks barefoot across a beach, so smooth it could pass for well-brushed velvet. If you happen to find yourself still awake a few minutes from now, you may feel free to listen on or drift off. Njord's footsteps will continue at the same unhurried tempo regardless, sifting through sand that remembers sailing stories even better than sailors do. He pauses where the tide has drawn a faint scalloped hem, sets the plank upright, and waits for a friendly wave to nudge it back over, as though the sea itself were signing the time card for the start of night. The wave arrives on schedule, sighs politely at Njord's ankles, and tips the driftwood with a soft thunk no louder than the closing of a library drawer. Njord nods once, satisfied that evening has officially clocked in, and begins his quiet ritual of sorting shoreline treasures that no one asked to be sorted, but everyone appreciates. A little farther up the beach, a mound of driftwood reclines, like guests at the sleepiest picnic imaginable, each piece chosen for its promise of calm, rather than its visual flair. Jared lifts a narrow branch, the shade of old parchment, and inspects the faint groove where some long ago barnacle tried its hand at calligraphy, perhaps composing underwater sonnets about seaweed etiquette. He hums a tune 9 notes none, in a hurry, and places the branch beside another whose knot resembles a closed eyelid halfway through a pleasant dream. The god of winds and tides has mastered an art unrecorded by skalds, arranging driftwood so that no two adjacent pieces share the same level of eagerness, a balancing act of personalities subtle enough to soothe restless breezes. Occasionally, he discovers a plank still smelling faintly of pine tar and adventure. He holds it with a gentle grin, then tucks it deep within the pile, where the scent can drowse into something resembling the memory of a campfire that never had to burn too brightly. A pair of sandpipers tiptoe nearby, performing what looks like an improvised soft shoe routine, their tiny beaks keeping time better than any metronome. Njord dips a finger into a shallow tide pool and traces sleepy circles until a miniature. Whirlpool forms, barely large enough to twirl a thought, then lets it go wobbling off like a jellyfish wearing an invisible tutu. Somewhere behind the dunes, seaborne grass shrugs in the evening breeze, each blade a hush elongated into green. The tide, having noticed the growing sculpture of driftwood, decides to offer commentary in the form of 3 particularly slow waves, each arriving with the leisurely enthusiasm of a cat inspecting unopened mail. They spread across the sand and withdraw with a tender shuffling sound, leaving behind thin arcs of foam that sparkle for a heartbeat before choosing to forget they ever sparkled. Jared kneels to compare the arcs, the way one might compare handwriting. Samples, and shakes his head in mild amusement at the middle wave for using slightly excessive flourish. He marks the foam's retreat with a twig placed crosswise, an informal note in the beach's diary, then resumes stacking wood so loosely that the spaces between pieces feel like sentences trailing into thoughtful ellipses. If you are still listening, you might like to know that every 33rd piece Njord selects must, by tradition he invented on a quiet Tuesday, contain at least one accidental whistle hole. These holes, round as sleepy mouths, produce the faintest hum when the evening wind drifts just right, a sound similar to a kettle deciding it would rather not bother boiling after all. Should a plank fail the whistle test, Jared calmly demotes it to shoreline guard duty, where its primary task is to lie comfortably and offer existential support to passing crab's dot as night thickens into a velvet pocket. Jared lights a fingertip-sized lantern whose glow is so shy illuminates only whatever it immediately forgives. He hangs it on the tallest branch of his wooden arrangement, and the pieces nearest the light take on hues of warm oatmeal and moon-kissed parchment. Cozy in their brief moment of recognition, the god leans back on his heels, listening as the whistle holes gradually tune themselves to a minor chord that no mortal ear would bother naming, the kind of chord perfect for rocking insomniac muscles back to slumber. In the distance, a lone seal offers a commendatory bark that sounds uncannily like an approving nod, then returns to floating on its back, flippers folded over its chest like a tourist who fell asleep hugging a complimentary mat. Njord gathers the last fragment of the evening's harvest a splinter, crooked as a question mark and nested in the heart of the sculpture where it can wonder about nothing in particular. The beach, now dotted with small pools reflecting a quilt of unfamiliar constellations, seems to settle a fraction deeper into the planet, as though tucking itself beneath its own shoreline, satisfied that the arrangement feels neither symmetrical nor contrary. Jared brushes sand from his palms and stands in the hush between 2 wind gusts. He looks out across the water, where distant waves practice the art of arriving exactly when expected, and he offers them a salute as languid as a leaf turning over in its sleep. In response, the horizon emits one final shimmer, the visual equivalent of a yawn, and then all is quiet save for the ongoing commentary of whistle holes conversing softly amongst themselves. Drake steps away without turning his back on the sculpture etiquette, apparently for polite departures from improvised art, and makes his way to a weather-smooth bench carved from the hull of a boat that once believed it would circumnavigate. In sight, he sits, stretches his legs out before him, and allows the soft grain of the bench to compare stories with the soles of his feet. If your thoughts are still rambling alongside mine, you might notice the faint salt taste in the air resolving into something reminiscent of buttered toast left out just long enough to become nostalgic. The lantern on the sculpture flickers once, as if clearing its throat before a lullaby, and the small hum of assembled wood drifts upward, mingling with the breath of the tide too considerate to interrupt. No resolutions are sought, none required. Time itself reclines on a dune, and the night wanders gently forward with the patient optimism of another piece of driftwood looking for a place to belong. You may find it quietly curious that justice, which elsewhere arrives with gavels and sudden verdicts, drifts across the island of Glitnir like pollen deciding where to rest, unhurried and almost invisible, in the silver-roofed hall of Forsetti, the god whose specialty is gentle consensus. Evening begins not with proclamations, but with the soft creak of a cupboard where he keeps his collection of polishing cloths. He chooses one the color of early fog and folds it over his arm the way a librarian might cradle an especially docile book, then walks the echo-light length of the marble chamber until he reaches a particular bench that caught an extra fingerprint of dust during the day. The bench, for its part, waits in mild anticipation, as though a stone might enjoy the prospect of conversation. And indeed, Forsade greets it with a whisper so soft even the cloth must lean closer to hear. He begins to buff the surface in slow, circular motions, each rotation no larger than a snail's deliberation, tracing sleepy constellations that only benches and very patient stars could name. If you discover you are still listening after a handful of those circles, you may feel free to call up more episodes of these drowsy wanderings, though the bench would be equally content if you drifted off and left it to dream alone, with every. Past the marble gleams a little brighter, not in a showy way, but with a muted glow of moonlight that has decided to practice humility. A tiny sigh of stone meets cloth, the sort of sound a feather might make if it remembered to breathe, and the hall responds with a hush so indulgent it could be mistaken for a compliment. Not far away stands a neat table holding 3 identical jars of polishing paste, their labels written in ink so pale it can only be read by lamplight, one mixed with ground seashell, another scented faintly of lavender that prefers silence to perfume, and a third tinged with the almost forgotten smell of parchment eager to be written upon. Forsetti dips 2 fingers into the lavender jar tonight, murmuring that calm disputes require calm fragrances, and the paste replies with a shimmer like a very small puddle applauding the moon. The cloth accepts the paste, and together they weave lullabies across the stone grain, encouraging every tiny vein of quartz to relax its posture. Visitors often assume justice involves stern faces and decisive gestures, yet here it resembles housekeeping done with ceremonial slowness, the way some people water plants while thinking through gentle philosophies, while cloth and bench converse. Lanterns suspended from the rafter beams sway on near invisible chains. They do not flame. Rather, they glow from within, each containing the memory of a settled argument, perhaps 2 farmers agreeing that a boundary stone felt happier slightly to the left, or siblings realizing the spoon belonged equally to both of their childhoods. Those memories have been folded into light so thoroughly that even moths seem reluctant to interrupt. Every so often a lantern tilts just enough to sprinkle a faint lattice of illumination across the floor, and the pattern hums with the polite optimism of people who left a meeting having both won. The floor enjoys these designs and shifts its own shadows to accommodate them, a cooperation so modest most gods would overlook it. The Forsetti always nods appreciation. Across the hall, a water clock counts moments with droplets that fall as leisurely as old friends lingering at a doorway, reluctant to say goodbye. Each drop lands on a small silver plate and produces a note so quiet it might be mistaken for the echo of a note rather than the note itself. Forsetti matches his wrist. To that cadence, circle of cloth on first strip, gentle pause on second, an unhurried breath on third, then repeat. Scholars who have attempted to measure the interval left with notebooks full of ellipses and shrugging punctuation, for the clock refuses to be pinned to standard tempo, preferring instead the rhythm of whatever conversation the night is having. With itself dot in one corner, 3 clerks record proceedings that have not yet happened, scratching headers such as the disagreement about whose silence was louder, and leaving the remainder of the parchment blank for future ink. They do this partly to save time and partly because the act of preparing a scroll often persuades. A dispute not to bother emerging. Occasionally, one clerk lifts his quill to yawn, a drawn-out motion like a cat remembering it was comfortable, and the quill leaves a tiny swirl of ink midair before gravity sighs it down again. That swirl hovers long enough to become a character in its own right, maybe the beginning of a story about patience, then settles onto the page as a decorative comma. Outside, twilight completes its slow exhale, and night unfurls in a shade between. Deep indigo and the underside of a raven's wing. Through the high arches, the sea murmurs half-sentences, each wave stopping to look back at its footprint, deciding no further comment is needed. A single breeze rearranges a wisp of cloud in 2. The vague promise of tomorrow's weather forecast, then decides revisions can wait and drapes it back across the stars. Forsetti pauses his circles to acknowledge the moment, a small bow of the chin. Nothing more, and in that pause, one could almost hear the bench thanking him for the intermission dot in the reflecting pool encircling the hall's foundation. 2. Swans glide with the dignified slowness of librarians exchanging overdue compliments. Their wake draws lines of silver that the moon promptly erases before arguments about straightness can develop. Forsetti likes to imagine the swans are mediating long, forgotten quarrels between reeds and ripples, but the swans keep their counsel, offering only the whisper of wings as they turn another silent page in the water. To anyone watching, the pool looks like a gel ink signature practicing cursive under lunar supervision. Back inside, Forsetti lifts the cloth, now warmed by the marble's quiet gratitude, and unfolds a fresh square like a new paragraph in an endlessly considerate letter. He smooths a stray thread with the same patience he once offered a pair of mountain goats whose horns had entwined during an overenthusiastic nod. Untangling, he believes, is underrated. It teaches the fingers to value what cannot be kept and the mind to value what may be released. Resting atop a shelf above the paste jars is a bell of perfect silence. Ring it, legend says, and every unresolved grudge within earshot will forget why it felt important. Forsetti has never needed to ring it, just knowing it exists seems enough. For most quarrels to reconsider, the scene shifts again as lanterns dim to a hue reminiscent of eyelids viewed from inside a nap. Dreams drift down from the beams. One imagines a meadow where every blade of grass simultaneously votes for a picnic siesta. Another pictures an archive of apologies cross-referenced by melody and sincerity. Forsetti greets them all with a slight uplift of a corner lip and returns to his circles, now moving counterclockwise for the sake of variety. From somewhere near the doorway comes the slow click of footsteps belonging to a traveler who has reconsidered pleading. His case tonight. The footsteps reverse direction and fade, evidently satisfied that justice unattended is often justice pre-accomplished. The cloth's motion widens, slows, widens again until movement becomes suggestion. Suggestion becomes memory. Forsetti folds the now fragrant fabric into a neat rectangle of earned repose, balancing it on the marble's edge where it might dream of quiescent lutes and patient tides. He does not sit. Guardians seldom indulge recline. Instead, he closes his eyes for the span of 3 water drops, listening to quiet rise like warm dough beneath a linen towel. When he opens them, the bench gleams with an understated pride, reflecting a lantern's calm heartbeat and perhaps a hint of your own drowsy gaze. Outside, the swans complete their slow circuit, lifting wings in applause of nothing in particular. The moon tilts, contemplating a nap behind the horizon, but lingers to admire its reflection on the newly burnished bench. Forseti rests a palm upon the marble's cool surface, accepting its gratitude as one might accept a feather in an open. Handlight, precise, ready to depart. There are more benches, more nights, more cloth folds waiting to unfold, and though dawn remains several thoughtful hours away, time itself appears to consider pausing, just long enough for the next swell of hush to settle softly into place, as if silence were a blanket eager to tuck itself around every remaining thought still awake and persuade it, with the gentlest insistence, to drift quietly toward dream. You may be quietly amused to learn that the sharpest sound in all of Rimheim is not the snap of a distant glacier or the crackle of frost beneath a boot, but the almost imperceptible sigh a snowflake makes when it realizes it has landed exactly where it meant to flat upon the vellum page of Skadi's ever-growing winter ledger. The Jotun-born huntress, whose bowstrings could once silence a charging bear, now spends her soft midnight hours in an occupation so hushed it might be. Mistaken for thinking, she catalogues the innumerable shapes of falling ice, noting each crystalline whim the way a librarian might index pleasant daydreams. Tonight, beneath a sky glazed with northern lights that refuse to hurry across the firmament, she sits at a broad spruce desk set out on the balcony, where the air is crisp enough to keep thoughts from melting and calm enough to keep them from flying away. The ledger lies open on a pillow of mink, its pages pre-chilled by resting all afternoon in a brass-lined chest of packed snow. Warm parchment would be rude to snowflakes, Skadi explains, like handing someone a seat that's still gotten it. Remembers the last occupant too vividly. Should you be awake long enough to wonder, the ink she uses is brewed from midnight blueberries and a fingertip of powdered quartz, stirred so slowly that each swirl takes the measure of a minute, an ideal pace for writing things unlikely to. Change dot at the precise moment the moon completes its shy peak over the ridge. Skadi extends a gloved hand into the snowfall and invites a single flake to settle on the soft gray leather. She addresses it in a whisper only flakes can hear, complimenting its symmetry, which is polite, and its decision to exist, which is generous, before transferring it to the waiting page with a sable hairbrush, delicate enough to count as a friendly breeze. Her handwriting, all slender arcs and measured descenders, surrounds the flake with descriptions so specific they sound like secrets, radius equal to the pause between 2 polite questions, density approaching that of a lullaby, just before it slips into humming, sparkle comparable to the memory of morning frost on an unused window pane. Every note ends with a small curved flourish, resembling a skier's final turn into soft powder, a tiny signature of joy disguised as punctuation. A mild irony drifts in the air that a deity famed for swift skis now finds fulfillment in cataloging. Things that refuse to travel far, but irony here is as gentle as the light from the aurora. It flickers, it passes, it asks nothing loud of anyone. Somewhere down in the Pine Valley, an owl considers hooting, then thinks better of it. Even nocturnal commentary has learned the pleasure of silence when snow is busy writing its own quiet letters to the ground. After precisely 3 dozen, flakes and numbers Skadi likes because it divides nicely into the hours of a long winter night she pauses to sip from a cup of birch-sweetened tea that never truly steams. The ceramic is kept at a temperature so agreeable that the tea warms thought without disturbing breath, a trick taught to her by a dune, who insisted simmering water after dusk was just another form of gossip. In the second scene, the snow changes. Character: larger dendrites drift down as if encouraged by having an audience, each one shaped like a gentle argument in favor of taking things slowly. Scotty picks them out of the air with the patient dexterity of someone harvesting wishes from a dandelion head, and when one lands inverted, she offers it a dignified twirl with the brush handle so it may present its better side to posterity. A micro hook lands here for anyone still barely awake. She records that this particular flake resembles, in miniature, the floor plan of Valhalla's West Wing, including, most amusingly, the broom closet where Thor once misplaced Mjolnir. For an entire afternoon, though the official saga politely dropped that footnote, the idea of a weapon of thunder sulking among buckets draws a rare smile from Scotty, so slight it frost etches a crescent in the corner of her cup. She writes the observation down, not because snowflakes care for jokes, but because future readers might secretly enjoy a bedtime smirk while pretending to study. Meteorology dot somewhere between the tea's last whisper and the next page's first receptive hush. The third movement drifts in with flakes so fine they appear only when they catch. Starlight, an effect akin to glitter spilled on midnight velvet, but disciplined by gravity to fall in orderly quiet. For these she turns to a special magnifying lens carved by dwarves, who claim it can focus on moments rather than distances. Through it she sees universes nested within hexagons, each facet reflecting infinitesimal colors that no paint has yet bothered to replicate. She describes them as gently as one might describe the texture of a dream, using comparisons drawn from comforting edges of experience. One flake, for instance, seems to echo the gentle curve of a cat settling into fresh laundry, while another displays a branching pattern reminiscent of the polite way ivy chooses walls to climb, never in a hurry, never quite asking permission, yet always resulting in a view improved. Now and again, she includes a modern analogy so muted it wears slippers. She notes a particular plate crystal looks like a carefully folded paper fortune teller, the playground kind that asks you to pick a color and reveals a future promising nothing more dramatic than, say, a second cup of cocoa. The northern lights reply with a lazy ripple, changing from sea glass green to the peach hue of half-remembered dawn, as though they, too, have decided predictions are best kept small and reassuring dot as the night enters its final, barely perceptible quarter. Scotty's ledger grows heavier with annotations while the snowfall thins to a polite curtain of stray sparks. She closes the book halfway, leaving enough page, showing for one last flake to feel welcomed, and rests her chin on a mittened fist, listening to the distant hush of ice settling on the far slopes, a sound that resembles the slow rearrangement of porcelain cups in a careful cupboard. In this gentle cadence, she recalls, without effort, the first winter she spent entirely alone after choosing mountain winds over Aesir feasts, a choice some called stubborn, but she has always regarded as simply well-tuned to her breathing. The memory behaves like a sleeping cat on her lap, warm, unmoving, and content to be stroked once before drifting deeper into stillness. Another micro hook glides in. She remembers that on that solitude's first morning she cooked porridge on a stone warmed only by friction, stirring exactly 100 turns because Odin claimed even numbers confuse misfortune. The porridge tasted like philosophical oatmeal, equal parts grain and contemplation. She writes the anecdote in the margin with ink diluted to a whisper, certain only the very drowsy will reach it. When at last a single star slips behind a lazily drifting cloud, Scotty settles the sable brush across the ledger's spine as one might lay a bookmark at the edge of tomorrow, and folds the last exposed corner of page against the flake now sleeping upon it. She ties the book with a ribbon of braided pine needles, fragrant enough to remind future readers of patient forests, then places it back in its snow-cooled chest where tiny breaths of frost immediately volunteer to guard its contents. The balcony lantern dims itself, more an obedient thought than a flame, and the huntress leans on the railing, watching the final stray crystals spin through a beam of starlight like dandruff from an over-polite constellation. Somewhere beneath the drifts, the mountain exhales a draft of air that has traveled through miles of silent quartz corridors just to arrive without hurry at her feet. She listens, smiling at a joke the snow tells only by existing, a joke that lands like a blanket rather than a punchline, and she knows another ledger will open tomorrow night, just as slowly, just as willingly. For now, the scene drifts into a hush so complete, it leaves space for the listener's eyelids to agree with gravity, and the snow continues writing its patient footnotes across the world, one soft syllable at a time, endlessly ready to be catalogued, endlessly content to be simply falling. You may find it quietly curious that the most patient note in all of Asgard is not one sung by a choir of Valkyries, nor hummed by a passing breeze through the world tree, but a single, barely there tone Bragi coaxes from his lyre each night before anyone else remembers to listen. It is a note so shy it often arrives wrapped in its own silence, like a letter tucked inside a thicker envelope just to be certain it will not wake the neighbors. And when at last it slips into the hall, the sound feels less like vibration and more like the softest thread of thought drifting across a half-remembered dream. Tonight, as a moon the color of watered milk hangs politely beyond the high window slits, Bragi sits on a smooth ashwood stool whose legs creak with the unhurried dignity of old librarians, and he begins his gentle ritual of endless tuning. Should you discover that you are still awake when the sixth string settles into its yawn of resonance, you might feel free to nudge whatever quiet mechanism summons future wanderings, though I will remain blissfully unaware if your eyelids stage an early intermission. The first scene of this soft midnight unfolds around a single length of catgut that Bragi slides between thumb and forefinger as if feeling for memories stored in the grain. He murmurs that the string once belonged to a cat so lazy it never bothered to chase its own whiskers, a creature whose greatest athletic achievement was stretching from one sunspot to the next without standing up. Bragi likes to imagine the feline's languor survived the transformation, soaking into the fiber so every pluck now contains the echo of a luxurious nap. He fastens one end to a peg carved with a verse no one has fully read, mostly because the letters keep swapping places when no one looks, and he tightens until the note reaches, a timbre best described as the moment just before a yawn becomes audible. Around him, the hall of Breidablik remains hushed, save for distant hearth embers sighing in their sleep and, very occasionally, the faint thump of a book rearranging itself on a shelf for improved posture. Bragi tests the string again, smiling at the tiny quiver that flutters through the wood like a moth, deciding whether to comment on the decor, then lets the sound fade until it is indistinguishable from memory, which is exactly where he wants it. A gentle transition drifts in with the second string, spun from a filament so fine that even the dwarves blinked when they realized it was a sliver of dawnlight captured on a winter solstice and braided until it thought it was tangible. Bragi strokes it once, and the resulting tone resembles a frost-rimmed bell far away in someone else's morning, the kind of chime you are never quite sure you heard. He remarks, half to himself, that dawnlight strings grow more agreeable if invited to gossip about sunsets, and so he obliges by recalling in a whisper how last evening's sky misbuttoned its colors, leaving a streak of peach wandering through violet like a tourist in the wrong queue. The string hums in sympathetic amusement, at least Bragi insists it does, and who could disprove him when the sound is so fine it may only exist sideways? Beyond the window, a single cloud shaped suspiciously like a quill floats by, possibly eavesdropping before it drifts off to annotate the night. Somewhere in the rafters, a solitary sparrow, centuries retired from any heroic role, adjusts a feather and resumes its hobby of dreaming up new definitions for silence, each quieter than the last. The third quiet scene arrives as Bragi replaces a slightly stubborn third string fashioned from hair he once trimmed from his own bronze red beard. A humorous practicality, he explains by noting that inspiration occasionally molts. He spins the strand slowly, twirling it between finger and thumb until it slips into a tiny loop, then settles the loop around a peg that prefers to be addressed politely but not too formally. Sir, peg is acceptable. Your pegness would be excessive. As tension climbs, the string releases a warm, humming note reminiscent of honey warming beside a stove, sweet but unhurried. Bragi pauses to taste a metaphor on his tongue, decides it is underseasoned, and sets it aside to simmer. He takes a sip of mead from a mug that has over years memorized the exact temperature of his pauses, and in that sip he claims to hear whole sagas queuing up, though they are in no hurry to be sung. They are content to loiter behind his teeth until the hall brightens a shade closer to morning. Gently he plucks all 3 tin strings together, and the cord folds across the room like a blanket being shaken out over fresh linen. Settling dust no one knew was floating dot in the final, drowsiest passage of the night. Bragi turns to his favorite and faintest pair of strings, one woven from a promise Odin once muttered into the neck of a bottle, the other from the quiet gasp a candle makes when it surrenders to its own wick. These two are fragile as spider silk, yet oddly sturdy, confident that fragility, when respected, can survive almost anything. He threads them onto the bridge, humming a melody so low it might simply be the hall breathing, and begins a slow tightening that resembles nothing so much as the moon lifting itself a degree higher in the sky. With each incremental twist, he listens, not merely with ears, but with the patient skin of his forearms and the soft place behind his eyes where unfinished verses nap in hammocks. One string settles on a pitch you could mistake for the heartbeat of oak, the other chooses a tone like distant rain, deciding which roof to visit. Together they form an interval so gentle it could lull arithmetic into daydreaming. Bragi strums all 6 strings at last, and the lyre answers with a chord that feels simultaneously like beginning and ending. A musical Mobius loop where first and last are on speaking terms. He lets the resonance glide outward until it fades. Into the timbers, into the books, into the roaming quill-shaped cloud now dissolving into stars, until finally only the idea of sound remains, softly folded away like a well-loved shawl. Bragi sets the lyre across his knees and studies the silent instrument with the mild satisfaction of someone who has rearranged all the furniture in their mind and discovered the new layout requires less walking. He does not declare the tuning finished, because finishing would suggest a time to start, and starting implies a performance, which might invite applause, and applause is terribly loud at this hour. Instead, he merely nods, as one might nod to a lamp before extinguishing it, and allows the hush to settle once more, thick and agreeable. Outside, the moon continues its gentle commute, filing paperwork only celestial bodies understand, while inside, the faint fragrance of the catgut string's imagined nap mingles with dawn-light gossip and the lingering sweetness of mead. By the time you notice your thoughts sliding quietly toward the pillow of themselves, the hall has already returned to deeper stillness. The lyre waiting with patient strings that will, given enough dark and enough slow breaths, loosen just enough to require tuning again, ensuring Bragi's gentle ritual may drift on and on without need of climax or conclusion, much like the night itself, forever content to hum at the edge of morning. You may find it quietly surprising that the softest glow in all of Asgard does not spill from the sunrise shimmering along Valhalla's golden eaves, but from a single line of beeswax candles that Hodr, the blind god of winter shadow, spends each evening nudging into the most patient of straight rows. The task begins just after the great hall's last cup has been drained and somewhere in the rafters, a lone raven mutters a bedtime remark about tomorrow's weather. At that moment, a hush unfurls like a fresh sheet across a rumpled bed, and Hodger, moving by memory rather than sight, sets his fingertips upon the first cool taper as though greeting an old friend who never raises their voice. If you remain awake long enough to notice, you might sense how the air in the corridor pauses to watch him, practicing its own stillness so as not to jostle the faint vibrations he uses to measure space. No, one remembers exactly when he adopted the habit, only that Balder, always fond of bright things, once owned far too many candles for one embodiment of sunshine to supervise. After Balder drifted into distant halls, the unburned candles lingered like quiet guests, reluctant to leave a pleasant gathering, and Hodger, feeling their patient potential, decided someone ought to keep them company. Each evening he carries the box out to a low stone shelf where winter light will one day land, though never urgently, and he lays the candles in a row, aligning their wicks the way a librarian straightens reluctant volumes so their spines can doze in orderly comfort. He taps each wick to be sure it bends just so, neither proud nor slumped, and the tap is as soft as the recollection of snowfall on the back of a wool muffed ear. Scholars argue whether he counts silently first candle, second candle, third, or whether he simply listens for the faintest difference in their honey-sweet scent, for apparently no two bees gather identical gossip from flowers, and wax carries that gossip like messages in bottles far too polite to reveal the punchline. No. And then he pauses to let an invisible draft pass, the same way a seasoned note-taker lifts their quill so the parchment may consider its next line. During those pauses, curious details float to the surface, perhaps a memory of the first day he heard frost creeping across a pond and knew it by name, or the faint click of mistletoe berries far away in a garden he chooses not to recall too vividly. If such thoughts lean toward sorrow, he studies them with the simple, wonderfully ordinary act of aligning wax. It is much harder for grief to unravel a heart that is occupied with whether candle 16 leans imperceptibly northward. Someone once asked why he does not allow a servant to handle the task, to which Hodder replied, in a voice low enough to pet a shadow, that order achieved without attention cannot soothe anyone. The remark drifted through the hall like a feather looking for a pillow to land on, and after that the servants merely respect the space, pressing their footfalls into silence the way snow accepts paw prints but never complains. Halfway through the arrangement, when exactly 24 candles glimmer with unlit promise, a soft scuttle announces the arrival of Vior, goddess of careful noticing, who sometimes brings fresh tapers rolled in parchment so thin it sighs when unwrapped. She does not speak. Instead, she places the new candles near Hodger's elbow and lets the quiet conversation between wax and fingertips resume. In the second phase, Hodger measures equal distances with the slender brass tool Balder once used to mark solstice greetings. Along the palace banister, the brass carries a memory of laughter in its faint warmth, and each time Hodger slides it between candles, the metal answers with a muted chime no louder than the farthest bell in a daydream. Those gentle chimes become landmarks in the stillness, reassuring anyone who listens that time has not stopped. It is merely walking barefoot, at intervals just wide enough to keep drowsiness politely intercaned. Hodger allows himself a whimsical adjustment, turning one candle a fraction so that its wick looks content, or nudging another minutely backward so its shadow will fall into step with its neighbor when dawn eventually wanders through. Should you still be conscious at this moment, you might notice how even the shadows among shadows behave as though they are being composed for a portrait few eyes will see, and yet they pose anyway, convinced dignity resides in posture rather than applause. Outside, night continues knitting darker strands into its tapestry, occasionally dropping a star for brightness, but retrieving it before anyone misses the dim spot. From beyond the courtyard, the faint crunch of an insomniac fox exploring fresh snow carries a punctual rhythm, as if nature were tapping along to Hadra's metronome of brass chimes. Inside, warmth hovers gently, a quiet hearth glow that never dares flicker too high for fear of ruffling the candle's calm. Some storytellers claim that once a year, when the candles are perfectly aligned and Hadra rests a palm on either end of the row, their wicks emit a collective sigh that drifts upward, curls through the beams, and nudges the aurora into a slightly neater ripple. Whether or not this is true, the aurora never objects to the rumor, finding it flattering to be thought of at all during such a sleepy hour. Eventually the line reaches its ceremonial 49th candle, a number Hadra likes because it balances symmetry with the immodest charm of an odd numeral, and at this milestone he pauses, breathing in through his nose as if smelling whether the silence has baked to ideal tenderness. The final scene unfolds almost invisibly. He lifts the last candle, heavier with beeswax than the rest, turns it twice so that whatever latent wish hides in its wick may orient toward gentler outcomes, and sets it down with the faintest click small enough to hide behind a raindrop if it wished. All at once, nothing changes, except that the corridor seems to inhabit its own exhale, and Hadra, satisfied in a way only the blind can measure with heartbeats instead of eyes, folds the empty box and slides it beneath the shelf where tomorrow's quiet chore will wait. There is, of course, no grand lighting of the candles. Illumination is someone else's specialty. Instead, the row remains unlit, glowing softly only in imagination, which is often the safest kind of light for fragile midnight thoughts. He turns away, cane lightly brushing the floor, not to guide but to greet familiar boards, and the candles stand sentinel over nothing in particular, a gentle civilian militia of wax ready to soften the dark, should the dark ever forget how kind it can be. Hadra's footsteps diminish down the hall like snowflakes deciding when to melt, and if you, too, feel your thoughts beginning to melt into quieter shapes, you might recognize that order in such moments is simply another lullaby composed of straight lines, brass chimes, and honey-scented shadows content to stay exactly where they are. You may find it quietly surprising that the earliest rustle in all the 9 worlds is not the crow of any heroic rooster, nor the distant yawn of a newborn star, but the faint snip of small shears navigating the silk-fine strands of fate long before the sky has decided which shade of blue to wear. The sound begins in that gauzy hush between not yet night and almost morning, when even insomnia dozes off for a moment, and it rises from the base of Yggdrasil where the 3 Norns are, Vergandi and Skuld conduct what can only be described as an eternal session of quiet tiding. They sit upon a root so broad it might be mistaken for the floor of a patient cathedral, its bark etched with runes that record more birthdays than a diligent librarian is willing to file. And each goddess leans forward with the posture of one threading a needle in uncertain light, or holds the oldest shears, forged of thoughts so ancient they have forgotten how to become anything other than gentle. While Vergandi's pear gleams like dew that refuses to drip, and Skuld, still fond of possibilities, uses an instrument that occasionally hums a note of polite disagreement before it closes. On this particular dawn, the kind that smells faintly of moss, warmed by unlit sunbeams, the threads lie across their laps in sleepy tangles, colors shifting with the shy, grace of dreams deciding whether to linger. You might picture these strands as mere yarn, but each carries the subtle weight of a lifetime size, the fluttering beat of decisions almost made, and the cool hush of secrets never spoken aloud. It is said that if you hold such a thread, to your ear you will not hear events, but rather the sound of a curtain lifting somewhere far away, as though the world, even now, were only beginning to clear its throat. whose calm resembles the steadfast silence of a closed book, selects a thread the color of late-season wheat and snips off the frayed tip as casually as one might trim a loose string from a well-worn cardigan. The fragment lands upon the soil and dissolves into a swirl of tiny sparks that drift upward like particles of well-behaved dust. Somewhere overhead, a squirrel pauses mid-scamper to witness the brief glimmer, then resumes its own timeless mission involving acorns. In moderate exaggeration, some scholars, eager for excitement, have wondered whether each cut is accompanied by thunder or chorus. The truth is far softer. Every snip releases a sound no louder than a bookmark sliding into place, followed by a sigh so content it might be mistaken for a leaf settling upon water. Vergandi, ever attentive to the near present, hums a melody, composed of pauses more than notes, 4 beats of quiet, then 2, then an entire bar of silence that seems to glow instead of echo. She straightens a strand that has begun to kink like a ribbon left too long in a drawer, smoothing it between fingers that smell faintly of cedar and ink. Occasionally, she adds the gentlest twist, as though reminding the thread that anticipation should curl but never knot. If you are still awake, you might notice how your own breathing syncs with the slow rhythm of her hands, each inhale measuring the distance between possibility and probability, each exhale releasing the thought that tomorrow could very well arrive. With its shoelaces untied and still managed just fine, schooled, youngest and fond of whispering what-ifs into cups of cooling tea, handles strands that have barely gathered a season's worth of intent. She clips nothing yet, preferring to place minute wooden pins carved from fallen twigs of the world, trousseau, that future adjustments will know precisely where comfort resides. These pins do not pierce. They merely clasp the fibers with the courtesy of a handshake offered in a dream. Sometimes a pin winks in faint silver, as though aware it may one day become a hinge upon which an unlikely coincidence will swing open. Schooled keeps a tiny ledger of such moments in her pocket, pages so thin they can be turned only by hope, or, on breezy mornings, by a passing sigh from the sleeping river nearby. Rumor insists the final page is left blank on principle, just in case someone invents a brand new shade of quiet. The 3 work without spoken dialogue, communicating instead through the subtle semaphore of eyebrows and the occasional rearrangement of shared teacups. Their teapot, resting on a low shelf of root, brews a blend rumored to taste like the first thought you forget upon waking. Steam rises in loops, tracing transient runes in the chill air, and each rune dissipates the instant it realizes it has been understood. From time to time, art pours a measure into 3 mismatched cups, one chipped, one glazed in an optimistic yellow, one painted with a spiral that never quite meets itself. And they sip in unison, and in that pause, even the threads appear to relax, lying flatter across their laps as though remembering how pleasant it is to be gently considered. Should you linger in imagination near that steam, you might catch notes of time, warm stone, and the faint suggestion of page corners turned very softly under lamplight. Beyond the immediate glow of early dawn, the horizon practices its palette, stroking on tints of salmon, then erasing them for blush, finally settling on a blue so tentative it looks as if it might apologize for arriving. Light filters through leaves overhead, scattering dappled freckles over the Norn's hands and the patient root beneath them. Each freckles lands in perfect coincidence with the heartbeat of someone somewhere who has just then decided to press snooze. A raven, probably ignorant of destiny but fond of conversation, lands nearby and offers a sentence in rough poetry, which the goddesses acknowledge with an almost imperceptible nod. They do not answer, they rarely do. Destiny, after all, is mostly about listening and very little about remarks that could be quoted later. Scene changes here are subtle as curtain folds. The air warms by less than a whisper, and with it the threads develop a faint elasticity stretching slightly as luminous possibilities wander through. Sets aside the wheat-colored strand and selects one shimmering like watered silk and candlelight. Its surface catches tiny reflections, perhaps distant memories of lanterns guiding late walkers home, and she trims a single filament no longer than an eyelash. The act feels less like editing and more like inviting comfort to find an easier chair. Burgundy adjusts her posture, knees drawing up to cradle a skein tinted the soft green of question marks. She hums again, this time a phrase reminiscent of forgotten lullabies. And somewhere in Midgard, a child turns over in sleep, dreams shifting from restless to plush. Skuld, meanwhile, taps a pen twice and smiles, certain that in some small town, a greeting will be offered at just the right time to someone who did not expect kindness before breakfast. She does not record the moment yet. She trusts the air will remember until the ink feels ready. A droplet of dew slides down the trunk, gathering motes of dawn light until it resembles a tiny traveling lantern. It pauses at the edge of a room. That predicts absolutely nothing, for not every marking on the tree is prophecy. Some are simply memories the bark enjoys keeping for sentimental texture. The droplet quivers, then tips onto the moss, leaving behind a darker streak that will fade before anyone thinks to measure it. Such is the grand urgency of the hour. If you have been following the gentle clipping and smoothing, you may notice a rhythm: snip, breath, hum, steam, pen, sigh, repeat. This cadence forms the lullaby of the cosmos, a metronome so quiet that most hearts imitate it without realizing. Once every handful of snips, Ur closes her shears and polishes the blades with a cloth woven from retired sunbeams, threads that once lit winter windows and have since chosen a quieter service. The cloth emits a fragrance like dust motes, warming in a library shaft, and in response the neighboring leaves tremble in a breeze that only they can feel. Eventually, the eastern sky selects a confident gold, the sort that persuades birds to rehearse soft versions of their usual fanfare. The Norns, in agreement that dawn has found its footing, place their tools upon a circular stone that has served as a work table since before memory learned to keep journals. They do not review what has been trimmed, for results will reveal themselves in their own measured tempo, perhaps appearing as a resolved hesitation in someone's voice or an unexpected shortcut revealed by afternoon light. Instead, they pour one last cup of that quietly vanishing tea, drinking without hurry until the steam dwindles to thin wisps that surrender to warming air dot as light strengthens. Shadows retreat beneath the great root, curling like sleepy cats, before slipping into crevices where they will dream of cool evenings to come. Gathers the trimmed ends, the faint embers of spent possibility, and releases them into the smallest of nearby streams, where they swirl into patterns reminiscent of polite applause heard from several rooms away. Burgundy stretches her shoulders, which creak softly, the sound of wood settling in an old chair, while Skuld tucks her ledger back into the pocket of a gown that seems always one step ahead of seasons. None of them speak a closing word. Endings, like conclusions, are notions for later myths. Instead, they let the moment dilate until it feels as wide as morning itself, then rise together, threads flowing from their laps in soft cascades that find new order upon the root. Their footfalls upon the earth are so light they leave only ideas of footprints, and the garden beneath Yggdrasil absorbs those ideas like seeds for thought yet to be planted. In their wake, the shears remain upon the stone, cooling slowly, blades faintly reflecting the awakening sky. A breeze wanders by, inspects the tools, and decides they are exactly where they need to be, perhaps nudging one a fraction of an inch purely for symmetry. A final snippet of hush floats upward, threading itself through branches until it becomes indistinguishable from the day's first bird song. And somewhere in a room not far from your own, a clock forgets to tick for a breath, rediscovering the luxury of stillness before picking up the beat once more, quieter now, as though time itself has been gently reminded that there is no great hurry at all.